So it is my pleasure to have known Dan and Debbie. And I always mention Debbie with Dan. She's right there in the background doing a million things. And then Dan is the Publication of Interpreter Foundation, and rightly so. He co-founded the Interpreter Foundation, and he's the president of the Interpreter Foundation. He received his PhD at the University of California at Los Angeles. He is a professor emeritus of Islamic Studies and Arabic at Brigham Young University. He founded the university's Middle Eastern Texts Initiative. We all know that he has published and spoken extensively on both Islamic and Latter-day Saints subjects. I won't read the rest of the bio there, but I will tell you this: Dan is the complete Renaissance man. You just have to mention a topic to him, and he is generally comfortable, and he can wax poetic on just about any topic that you throw at him. I always enjoy being around Dan, having the opportunity to listen to his expertise in so many fields, and he is going to speak to us today about The Apostles Go to England. So I'll turn it over to you, Dan.
Okay, I appreciate that. Can everybody hear me? I want to start off by just talking about the calling of the 12, the original calling of the 12, which happened in early 1835. The prophet Joseph Smith invited Brigham Young and his brother Joseph Young to his home in Kirtland and talked to them about what had happened at Zion's Camp. You remember Zion's Camp. It was in some ways, some considered it a failure, but he said, no, it wasn't, and others have said that as well. People were concerned about who had died on Zion's Camp. What happened to them? And Joseph said he had a vision of them, and he said, if I can have a place that's as bright as theirs, I would ask no more from the Lord than that. And he wept while he was telling the story, and then he said to Brigham Young that I want you to call a conference. We're going to appoint 12 special witnesses, and this will be designed to open the gospel to foreign nations. And pointing to Brigham, he said, and you will be one of them. And then he pointed to Joseph Young, Brigham's brother, and said, and you will be one of the presidents of the 70, whom we're also organizing. So of the original 12 apostles, 9 of them had been participants in Zion's Camp. And one of the fruits of that camp was they got to know Joseph really well. They listened to his teaching up close, and he got to know them very well. And you saw who was faithful, who murmured, who complained, and who was willing to give everything. Now, when the 12 were called, their function was quite different from the one that we know today. In section 102 of the Doctrine and Covenants, they're described as a traveling high council. Now, you have to go back to the day when there was really only one high council, or maybe when there were 2 stakes in Missouri and in Ohio, 2 high councils that were responsible for what you might call domestic affairs of the church. And then the 12 were responsible for everything outside the organized units of the church. They were a missionary quorum. And that will change, and that's part of the story that we'll be talking about tonight. Another thing that will change is when the quorum was first started, it was rather unstable. People came and went. The quorum didn't have a good, strong identity. And of course, that really took its toll in the late 1830s. In 1836, you had the great spiritual manifestations in the Kirtland Temple. But by May of 1837, just a little bit later, there were huge trials in Kirtland and elsewhere, financial speculations, dissensions, and so on. And it's at this point that something really dramatic is done. And it, to me, is evidence of Joseph Smith's calling as a prophet. The story is told, and this is told to us by Orson F. Whitney, who is Heber C. Kimball's grandson, that Joseph came to Heber, who was sitting more or less by himself, maybe completely alone, inside the Kirtland Temple, and said, Brother Heber, the Spirit of the Lord has whispered to me, let my servant Heber go to England and proclaim my gospel and open the door of salvation to that nation. So Heber was, as you can imagine, feeling overwhelmed by that. The thought that this humble, uneducated man would be sent off to England, a place that had the reputation of great culture and learning and civilization, much more so than the frontier of the Americas. So Heber said, well, can Brigham Young come with me? Because they were close friends, same age, had joined the church together and so on. But Joseph had other plans for Brigham at that point. So he said, no, he can't come with you. You're going on your own. But eventually Orson Hyde joined up. Orson was trying to get back into good graces there in the church. So Orson Hyde went, and they were so enthusiastic that when they arrived, you probably know this story, they couldn't wait for the little steam tender to bring them into port. They jumped off onto another boat, came in, jumped onto the shore, and were eager to start. Now, I have to say that Heber C. Kimball felt totally inadequate to this job, to this calling, but he turned out to be ideally suited in a way that he couldn't have known, I suspect, and that Joseph Smith couldn't have known. He thought maybe that he was going to be addressing the learned and the noble and the great in England. No, his work was mostly among the working class, and he was working class. He fit right in with them. He was a potter. He was a carpenter. He knew how to work with his hands. He felt comfortable speaking with people who worked with their hands, and they felt comfortable listening to him. And I'll come back to that in just a little while. So after 3 days in Liverpool, where they had landed, the chief port of England at the time, and the missionaries felt led by the Spirit to travel north by coach, not motor coach, but stagecoach in those days, to the industrial town of Preston, where Joseph Fielding's brother was a Methodist minister. Joseph Fielding was another member of this small group with Orson Hyde and Heber C. Kimball, and they felt that they should go there. And I think there was a good reason too. It was an industrial town. It was a town that was growing in the Industrial Revolution. And the group of missionaries arrived in Preston on the 22nd of July, 1837, during a parliamentary election. And as they alighted from the coach, they noticed there was a gilded banner with the motto, "Truth will prevail." And they exclaimed, "Amen, so let it be." Now, they were coming into the England, the United Kingdom of the time of the young Victoria, Queen Victoria. And, we see pictures of Victoria as this old lady dressed in black. But she wasn't always that. In fact, some accounts of her say, there's one that I've read, it's hard to square with the later image of Victoria, that she had only seen the sunrise through the windows of a ballroom because she liked to dance. And she was kind of active. She was very small. But she needed some settling down. And one of the things that did that for her was when she married a young German prince from an insignificant family, really, in Germany by the name of Albert. And there's a picture of him. He's not really a factor at this point, but I want to say something about Albert. I don't want to go too far astray because I know my time is limited. I had never understood the depth of her mourning. She's probably in what we would now say was a clinical state of depression about the passing of Albert, who died young from typhoid fever. But the more I've learned about him, the more impressed I am with him. Particularly, there was a biography of him a few years ago that I read a review of it, which really caught my interest, which said that he was very serious. He had hopes of making a kind of working monarchy. He believed in democracy, but he felt the monarch still had a role to play. Her eventual almost abdication of the role after his death gave us the kind of purely ceremonial monarchy that we have today. But he thought there was a real role for monarchy, but it was an enlightened one. And so he surprised people when he came over. He always spoke with a German accent, but he was very serious. He had a technical and engineering background. And so he was appointed ceremonially as the Chancellor of Cambridge University. But it really irritated the folks at Cambridge that Albert would show up to meetings. And he paid attention. And one of the reasons Cambridge came to have a really strong scientific and technical bent, as opposed maybe to Oxford, at least for a while, was Albert's influence. And then Albert got himself appointed as the patron of the Sewage Commission, the Sewer Commission in London. Only he would go out and actually walk through the work sites and point out things that were being done badly. And so they never had a royal in this sense who apparently took an active role in those kinds of things that seemed to be beneath their dignity. So an interesting guy, tremendous influence on her. They eventually had their work desks facing each other, and they would work on papers and so on all day. And when he died, it was a tremendous loss for her. But we're talking here about essentially the Victorian age. And so they arrive in Preston. I want to say something about Preston. It's one of the places we'll go. And this is the city shield of Preston, which maybe it's pure coincidence, but I think it's a really wonderful and apt place for effectively the birthplace of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in England. There you have the Lamb of God, Agnus Dei, holding the cross. And beneath the Lamb is PP, which stands for Prince of Peace, Princeps Pacis in Latin. And Preston takes its name from Priest Town. So there's a strong priestly Christian background to this place that really seems to me perfectly appropriate. And so they get to work there in Preston and in the area around it. And I'm just going to tell you a couple stories from that early mission. One I just think is a lot of fun. Um, One of the people who went along on that first mission was Willard Richards. I haven't mentioned him before, but Willard went along. And on the day that a young woman was baptized, the 4th of August, 1837, so not long after they'd arrived, her name was Janetta Richards, by the way. And Heber Kimball wrote to his fellow missionary Willard Richards and said, "Willard, I baptized your wife today," because Willard was not yet married. He was a bachelor. So this may be an early indication of Heber's great prophetic gifts, about which Brigham Young talked a lot. Um, but Willard had been working in the Bedford area, and then he came to visit Preston, and he had an interaction with Janetta. And while they were walking to a church service, he remarked, "Richards is a good name. I never want to change it. Do you, Janetta?" And she replied, "No, I do not. I think I never will." And that was effectively a kind of proposal, so that Willard and Janetta Richards were married there, which I think is just a charming little story. She was from a town not far inland from Preston. But there are two places I really want to talk about, especially one of them, and those are Chatburn and Downham. Oops, there's Janetta. I failed to show her image there. She didn't live very long. She died, unfortunately, at the age of 27 back in Nauvoo in 1845. Okay, here is a view in the town of. Sorry, I'm picking up something here. This is the town of Downham. One of the places where Heber C. Kimball had most success. When he first mentioned the idea of going to these villages from Preston to share the gospel, local people told him no, the area was wicked. Its villagers were hardened against Christianity. But his experience there showed quite the opposite. In fact, later on, after he'd converted many of the people in Downham, he has this story. The next morning, this is one at the end of his mission, 8 months later. The next morning, the villagers were all in tears, thinking they should see my face no more. When I left them, my feelings were such as I cannot describe as I walked down the street, followed by numbers. And we'll be walking down that street, paved now, but anyway. The doors were crowded by the inmates of the houses to bid us a last farewell, who could only give vent to their grief in sobs and broken accents. While contemplating this scene, we were induced to take off our hats, for we felt as if the place was holy ground. The Spirit of the Lord rested down upon us, and I was constrained to bless that whole region of country. We were followed by a great number, a considerable distance from the villages, who could hardly then separate themselves from us. My heart was like unto theirs, and I thought my head was a fountain of tears, for I wept for several miles after I bid them adieu. Now, Orson F. Whitney again, Heber C. Kimball's grandson, said later that the prophet Joseph told Heber in after years that the reason he felt as he did in the streets of Chatburn was because the place was indeed holy ground, that some of the ancient prophets had traveled in that region and dedicated the land, and that he, Heber, had reaped the benefit of their blessing. Now, I think that there's something really to that. The hill behind Downham is called Pendle Hill. And there are stories connected with it. One of the founders of Quakerism, George Fox, had a vision there where he saw people in white moving on Pendle Hill. It was associated at one point with witchcraft, but then John Wesley also said that he felt it was particularly sacred ground. And so I think you see the fulfillment of that in the great success that Heber C. Kimball had in Downham and Chatburn, right almost at the base of that hill. And Joseph's sense that it was holy ground, I think, is very interesting, because I doubt that he knew anything about the history of Quakerism there, or the history of Wesleyan Methodism, or anything that he could attribute that to. But he knew that this was a place that was holy. Now, on the 8th of April, 1838, when they left after this first mission, over 600 saints from Preston and the surrounding area met at the Cockpit, a former cockfighting arena in Preston, where they held some of their meetings, for a mission conference. And And so there, Joseph Fielding was chosen to be the mission president. He was an English-born person who'd come over with that first mission. His brother James was a Methodist minister in the area. And then Willard Richards was chosen to be, he of Janetta Richards fame, was chosen to be first counselor. And William Clayton, an English convert, whom you may know as the author of Come, Come Ye Saints, among other things, is a journal keeper for Joseph Smith, very important character. They were set apart as the mission presidency there to preside while Elder Kimball and Elder Hyde went home. And they went home on the Garrick on the 20th of April, landed in New York City on the 12th of May, 1838, and they left approximately 1,000 members in England, which is an amazing figure, considering they'd just arrived 8 months before with a message that was totally new. No organization, no support, nothing, that they made such a start there. Heber C. Kimball arrived in far west Missouri on the 25th of July, 1838. But a couple of weeks earlier, the prophet Joseph had received a revelation that would send Elder Kimball back to England, accompanied by other apostles. The revelation directed that the 12 be reorganized, calling men to take the places of those who had fallen and specifying the time that they should leave for the next mission. This is from Doctrine and Covenants 118. And next spring let them depart to go over the great waters, and there promulgate my gospel and bear record of my name. Let them take leave of my saints in the city of far west, on the 26th day of April next, on the building spot of my house, saith the Lord. Now, this came at a really bad time, in a way. 4 apostles had left the church after the difficult times in Kirtland. By the end of 1838, Thomas B. Marsh, the president of the Quorum, had turned against the church, and Elder David W. Patton, another member of the Quorum of the 12, had been killed at the Battle of, Crooked, something or other. My mind's gone blank. Crooked River, I think. Yeah. And that same year, Lilburn W. Boggs, of blessed memory, had issued the extermination order in Missouri, that the saints should be exterminated. The Hans Mill massacre had occurred. Joseph Smith and several other leaders had been imprisoned in Liberty Jail. The saints in Missouri had to move to Illinois, and Joseph was not available to lead them, so Brigham and Heber led them out of Missouri and into Illinois. Now, that, I think, is a significant thing, that at this point, Brigham and Heber are already taking their position as leaders of the church. Thomas Marsh has fallen. Brigham Young, by virtue of being the eldest in the Quorum, becomes the presiding officer of the Quorum. And Joseph Smith specifically asks that he and Heber lead the migration of the saints out of Missouri to the extent that they could. This gave them great experience, I think, and I think it's providential that Brigham and Heber, and eventually other members of the 12, have experiences like this in leading a mass migration. Because when the time comes when Joseph and Hiram and so on are no longer there, they kind of know how to do it. They've done it before, and they were equipped and trained. I don't think they welcome the experience, but nevertheless, I want to tell the story of a fulfillment of that prophecy. So the revelation came during a really trying time to send the apostles abroad. And they were told to take their leave from far west Missouri on such and such a date. Now, enemies of the church said this is one prophecy of Joseph Smith that is not going to happen. It's not going to be fulfilled. And a lot of members of the church said, yeah, it's all right. I mean, if we can't do it, we can't do it. The Lord will understand. And I even would say, being the kind of legalistic person who can worm my way out of even the clearest messages of Scripture if I need to, I would have said, well, it was saying let them do it. But it wasn't a command. It wasn't a revelation that they would do it. But here you see Brigham Young's character. Brigham Young put the episode into perspective. He said, thus was this revelation fulfilled. They managed to sneak back into Missouri by night, and a group of them laid the cornerstone symbolically for the temple at Far West and started their mission there. He said, thus was this revelation fulfilled, concerning which our enemies said, if all other revelations of Joseph Smith were fulfilled, that one should not, as it had day and date to it. Well, Brigham Young's faithfulness to Joseph Smith is one of the strongest characteristics that you can see. New apostles were ordained there at that ceremony. George A. Smith was called to the Quorum of the 12. He was only 21 and unmarried at the time. Once again, I'd say calling Heber C. Kimball one of the most faithful members of the church away from Kirtland to England at a time when the church is facing absolute chaos is counterintuitive, but I would say in that sense deeply prophetic. I don't know that Joseph Smith understood the need for it, but he knew that that was what he was supposed to do. And calling the 12, the most faithful members of the church, in some ways, to England is another deeply counterintuitive move. But Great Britain was an obvious place for the labors of the 12 abroad. It had been officially opened for missionary work by Heber Kimball in 1837-38, and it had proven to be a fruitful ground for converts, and they spoke English. However, it has to be said, since that time, the church in Britain had fallen on hard times. They'd baptized more people, but a lot had fallen away. And so there had been little increase in membership, not much compared to the initial burst. So it took the Quorum of the 12 and their strong leadership to regenerate the sort of lethargic missionary work there and to make it the most vibrant one in the church. But also important, I think, is the training and preparation that the 12 went through before leaving. They met frequently in the summer of 1839 with Joseph Smith, who instructed them in spiritual affairs, in doctrine, practical leadership, and so on. And here's a significant and sort of odd note. Many of the things he said foreshadowed some of their experiences in England. Devil experiences, for example, where the missionaries believed they were actually wrestling with the powers of darkness, were not uncommon after they arrived. Satan always shows up when something big is about to happen. Think of Jesus in the wilderness. Think of Moses in the book of Moses. Think of, I mentioned Joseph in the grove. I mean, he always shows up. If he can stop something, he will pull out all the stops to do it. So one of the things they were given was the key, kind of strikes us as odd sometimes, a certain key by which they could detect the devil if he appeared like a man. Well, they would come to encounter Lucifer and his hosts. And we'll talk about a couple of those cases too. As with so many saints in Commerce or Nauvoo at the time, most of the apostles, when it was time to leave, were seriously ill with malaria. George A. Smith was no exception. He had poor health at the time, high fever. He began his journey on horseback. And even on horseback, after about a mile and a half, he felt that he had to stop and rest a while. Stopped in at the house of his cousin, Joseph Smith. And when George entered the room where his uncle, Joseph Sr., lay sick in bed, the old patriarch burst out laughing, according to the account. He said, "Who's been robbing the graveyard?" he said, looking at George A. It's kind of ironic because George A. goes to England. He'll never see his uncle, Joseph Smith Sr. again because Joseph Smith Sr. will pass away. Now, what's going on in England at the time? We're entering the Dickensian period, the period of Charles Dickens. And if you've read any Dickens or seen any movies, you know that one of the things he talks about a lot is the condition of the poor, the humble in the big cities and so on. This is a time of the Industrial Revolution, with what William Blake called its dark satanic mills. It was a time of social upheaval. And let me say something about that. Social upheaval causes upheavals. It causes people to leave their comfortable circumstances, come into the cities, for example, to get work. And then they often find that the streets aren't paved with gold. They may not be paved at all, but conditions are tough. This was always true. It's always been true. It's a sociological fact that people who are uprooted are more open to new ideas. I think this played a role in the success of the missionary effort there. If you think about terms that we still have in England from the ancient church, we talk about the heathen. These were the people who dwelt on the heath, out in the countryside, where they were immersed in age-old patterns of society and family and so on, and were less open to new ideas. Or the pagans, from a Latin word, pagani, people who live in villages or out in the countryside. But it's the people often in the city, the urban proletariat, if you will, the uprooted working class, who come to these newly rising industrial cities, who are open to new ideas. This is a period when England was experiencing chronic economic and social difficulties, and the Latter-day Saint apostles and their co-workers presented an alternative to some of the other ideas that were there, and especially because they themselves were of the working class. I think that fits. England was the workshop of the world, some have called it, but beginning in 1837, providentially maybe, Industry came almost to a standstill for a while. There was high unemployment among the working classes in the manufacturing districts. There was destitution, starvation, and a lot of ideas began to circulate, including socialism, revolution, bringing about a whole new social order. But the gospel was more attractive, I think, to the people there because the dictatorship of the proletariat was not an idea that resonated with them, but the gospel message of a Christian millennium did. A world government headed by Jesus Christ. Poverty and hardship could be set aside for the hope of building God's true Zion in the New World. And there were already a lot of English people who were emigrating to the New World. This now gave them a religious cause for that as well. In other words, they taught a Christian kind of form of reform that would be familiar to their audience. It satisfied an inner longing for people there who knew this is not the way the world is supposed to be. This working class situation is not good for us. Now, you're not always going to get pictures of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in a Latter-day Saint lecture. I once made the innovation of citing Vladimir Lenin in a sacrament meeting talk. So, fools rush in where angels fear to tread. But I'll make my point here. Socialism was becoming a force to be reckoned with within a decade or so of the time the missionaries were first there. Engels would publish his important work of propaganda on the condition of the working classes in England. And this didn't come out of nowhere. The condition was really rough for a lot of them. That created in some minds a sense of the need for something like socialism, or it gave impetus to the socialist ideas of Marx, who, remember, wrote Das Kapital in the British Library. But the apostles sometimes sound almost like Engels in terms of what they were seeing. I'm not saying that his solution was right. I'm a libertarian, so economically, but I do understand a little bit where the Marxists were coming from, where Marxism-Leninism was coming from. Everywhere the apostles went in England, they found squalor. The poor, this is Wilford Woodruff, are in as great bondage as the children of Israel in Egypt. George A. Smith described the conditions among the saints in the Staffordshire potteries. Of the more than 450 saints in this district, not more than 1/3 of them have full employment. Many of the rest, not more than 2 or 3 days per week. Many have no work at all. Times are growing harder every week. Some are turned out of employ because they have been baptized by the Latter-day Saints. Heber C. Kimball wrote this about poverty in Manchester. I was asking some of the brethren what made the people look so bad. They said, and I'm having to read this carefully because his spelling is so strange. They said because they were famished for the want of food. Say they to me, there are hundreds that are starving for the want of food and other things. I thought there was misery enough in Preston. It is nothing to compare with Manchester. I asked them if they thought the brethren went hungry. Yes, many of them have not to eat. Times are so hard they can't quit work. Therefore they have to go hungry. There's been such a change here in 2 years as never was known by the oldest man in this land. This is Heber Kimball comparing what he'd seen on his first mission to what he saw on the second one. He later made an interesting observation. We saw Queen Victoria go by in a procession in London. You would be astonished to see the stir there is made over a little queen, at the time thousands starving to death for a little bread. Again, I'm not defending Marxism. I'm certainly not, but I think you can see the kind of soil out of which that idea would grow. The Depression naturally hit hardest among the working classes of the urban communities. And it was from among these people that most Mormon Latter-day Saint converts came. Perhaps one reason for the success of the gospel among the common people, as I've said, was the identification of the working classes, or with the working classes, felt by the American apostles, who were also workers by profession. In a letter to America dated on the 5th of September, 1840, Brigham Young and Willard Richards demonstrated considerable empathy with the poor in their criticism of the factory owners and the system of government taxes. They were horrified at the number of beggars and reported that all the spare change they had was given to the destitute. The 12 were intrigued by the factories, and they were really impressive, but they considered the industrial system to be exploitative. Following his tour through pottery works there in the pottery area, Wilford Woodruff reflected, the final step in the process of making fine china was the manufacturers aggrandizing themselves with the profit thereof. Joseph Fielding and Theodore Turley visited a factory, and Fielding recorded in his diary, I was much affected to see the slavery that is there endured, the dust, the bad smell of oil, etc., the deafening noise, and the confinement. Brigham Young said he believed that masters, that is, factory owners, care little for their manufacturers, that is, their laborers, and have reduced the worker's wage to almost the lowest extremity. In some ways, as I say, this resembles the sort of socialist critique. What I would say was the transitionary state through the Industrial Revolution to the prosperity that eventually came. Um, Now, another reason I think for the success of the Latter-day Saint missionaries was that Anglicanism was losing its status. And to an extent, so was Methodism. Now, I know far less about this than Chris does, so she'll correct me if I'm wrong. She may even intervene, may even, stop the sound. But I immediately, when I think of Anglicans losing their status, I think of Jane Austen's Mr. Collins. Now, there he is in an illustration of Pride and Prejudice. But if you've seen especially the BBC, I, I think you just can't beat the BBC rendition of Mr. Collins. He is such an idiot. And I'm sure that that's not fair, although Jane Austen was the daughter of a clergyman, and quite often the clergyman and Jane Austen are presented as hypocritical buffoons or whatever, sort of silly. One reason, as I say, for the success of the Latter-day Saints was the failure of the major religious bodies to attract working-class converts. Even the Methodists, who had such success in the 18th century, had, by the early years of Victoria's reign, gained sort of middle-class respectability. They were becoming comfortable. They didn't hobnob so easily with the people of the working class and that new sort of dirty industrial class. Jabez Bunting, who was maybe the greatest figure in the Methodist movement at the period, admitted, quote, the declining attendance of poor people at our services. He said, the main cause of their estrangement from us is radicalism, infidelity, and socialism. The only major body of Christians that could claim a steady increase in adherents during this period was the Catholics, but that was mostly because of immigrants from Ireland. It wasn't because the British working class were becoming Catholics. So the Latter-day Saints were actually one of the few religious bodies during this period who were having success among the working class, which is really quite interesting. Many of them had already left the Church of England. They'd left even the Methodists, and with many others had formed groups of what are often called seekers. And a notable one there is the so-called United Brethren, which had broken away from the primitive Methodists. And that sect, the United Brethren, was characterized by a highly democratic organization or administration, and they placed special emphasis on faith, repentance, good works, and the literal atonement of Christ as the elements of salvation. Now, does any of that sound very foreign to the preaching of the Latter-day Saints? It wasn't. And so they could come in and speak to those people in a way that resonated with them. They were already seeking a religious faith that would speak more to their more or less fundamentalist views and their democratic inclinations than the established Anglican Church did. And they joined various sects in their quest, and they were well prepared for the message of the gospel when it came. And again, I think it's the attitude of those early apostles that really helped them to connect with these people, because they didn't put on airs. And when the church comes, it's not fully democratic, obviously, but it is kind of, because anybody could rise up to become a leader. Anybody could be called to be, certainly any man could be ordained to the priesthood, and people of ordinary backgrounds, not particularly well educated, could hold leadership positions. And that's illustrated, I think, in this statement from George A. Smith, the youngest apostle, again, 21 when he was called, not long before the mission to England. And by the way, let me pause and say, I remember talking to Jim Allen, the late assistant historian of the church, and I asked him, when he wrote his book, co-wrote his book, Men with a Mission, what was it that struck him most about the 12 when they went to England in 1840? And he said, how young they were. He said, I knew how young they were, but I didn't really know how young they were until I really began getting into it. And then I realized this was a group of very young men who were sort of inventing the church in England and inventing themselves, reinventing themselves there. But here's George A. Smith writing to his brother from the Staffordshire Potteries. This cold weather makes me think of you, as I have to sleep alone and find it very cold. But I have a good bed and plenty of clothes to keep one man, and the night passes very comfortably, as I seldom go to bed before 12 o'clock, and very often lay till 2 o'clock in the morning. This comes from my having so many who come to hear me talk and receive instruction from me. You may well think I have to be a teacher of good principles to them that receive my testimony, and you cannot think how foolish it makes me feel to be looked up to with so much earnestness by persons who have been professors of religion and preachers of the different sects. I thank the Lord for the wisdom he has given me and the success I have had in the teaching this many, it must be, for there is now in this district no less than 28 official members of the church, and they all look to me for instruction as children to a father, and this makes me feel very small indeed, and causes me to cry unto my Father who is in heaven for wisdom and prudence to do my Father's work and sound his gospel to the world. That humility, I think, is really, really important. Now, we'll come to their great success. I want to start with an area where they didn't have much, and that's London. We'll be going to London. London, great city, wonderful city, never the most fruitful mission field for Latter-day Saints, or maybe anybody else. The general impression of London was negative when they got there. Wilford Woodruff wrote in his diary, "London's the hardest place I ever visited for establishing the gospel. It is full of everything but righteousness." Now, Wilford Woodruff was maybe the greatest missionary in the history of the church, but even he was stymied to an extent by London. Its very size overwhelmed Heber Kimball, who complained, quote, "of such a throng of people as I never saw before, and so much noise that we can neither sleep nor think." In addition, the three missionaries that were there that went to London were intimidated by the competition, I suppose, for souls. They wrote to America. This huge metropolis contained 606 different gods, gospels, redeemers, plans of salvation, religions, churches, commandments, essential and non-essential, orders of preaching, roads to heaven and hell. And this order of things had so affected the minds of the people that it almost required a horn to be blown from the highest heavens in order to awaken the attention of the people. George A. Smith and his fellow missionaries, when he was there, not only had to contend with antagonists on the streets of London, but also the powers of the adversary. I told you you'd get a couple of these stories. On September the 9th, Elder Smith recorded in his journal, "My rest was not pleasant, being constantly annoyed by visitations from the spirit of darkness, which required all my faith and energy of mind to resist." But he said, "I'm not going to say much about it." As time went on, these visitations from the spirit world became even more horrific. Wilford Woodruff told of an occasion when several evil spirits actually attacked him and Elder Smith. "It seemed as if there were legions of spirits in the room," he wrote. "They sought our destruction. On one occasion, these powers of darkness fell upon us to destroy our lives, and both Brother Smith and myself would have been killed, apparently, had not three holy messengers come into our room and filled the room with light." Elder Woodruff noted they were dressed in temple clothing. "They laid their hands upon our heads, and we were delivered, and that power was broken so far as we were concerned." Pretty dramatic story, but there's an equally dramatic one coming. John Taylor and Joseph Fielding, let's see. Yeah, there we are. John Taylor and Joseph Fielding. That is not Joseph Fielding, but anyway, we'll, I don't know where Heber C. Kimball comes in again. This was all done in real haste today, in between attention to the granddaughter, so there may be yet more embarrassing things coming. Who knows? So John Taylor and Joseph Fielding went back to Liverpool from Preston, where a number of their relatives lived. John Taylor, of course, was British-born and still had relatives there, including the Cannon family. And so there's another really important line. In fact, I should have had a picture of George Q. Cannon in this set, but I don't. But George Q. Cannon, counselor to four presidents of the church, territorial delegate to Washington, founder of the Deseret News, founder of Deseret Book, etc., 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 came out of this mission. They first preached to a congregation that was headed by Joseph Fielding's brother-in-law. Then they hired their own hall and took some of his flock, which eventually shut down the welcome that they were getting from the local ministers. Wilford Woodruff proceeded south. Oh, that's not Heber C. Kimball. Take a good look at him. That's a young Wilford Woodruff there on the right. So there was method to my madness. He proceeded south to an inland county of Staffordshire, stopped in an area called the Potteries. We've already alluded to it, which consisted of many scattered villages, contained about 20,000 people, and this was the most important center in England for the manufacture of china and earthenware. Again, an industrial phenomenon. And the area was was famous because of the influence of the late Josiah Wedgwood. Now, that name probably still means something to some of you, Wedgwood, China. Now, at this point, I'm going to jump to another odd connection. This is a picture of the relatively young Charles Darwin. Why do I mention Charles Darwin here? Because he's another important factor in 19th century Britain, for good or ill. But he was a grandson of Josiah Wedgwood. We don't make that connection very often. People will remember his famous scientific slash quack grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, on the one side, but on the maternal side, Josiah Wedgwood. And that was why Charles Darwin never had to work for a living. He could afford to sit around and be a dilettantish naturalist in a sense, but a very important one, because he was living off the Wedgwood China fortune. The apostles worked in the potteries with modest success for about 6 weeks until Wilford Woodruff said, "The Lord warned me to go to the south," and he leaves very abruptly, goes southward. He used to visit with a person there by the name of William Benbow, and William Benbow took him and introduced him to his farmer brother, John Benbow, at a place called Hill Farm. Yes, and there's Hill Farm today. And he cultivated about 300 acres of land near a small settlement called Castle Froome in Herefordshire. And that became an important center for Latter-day Saint preaching. Within 2 days, John Benbow and his wife Jane were among the first 6 converts to be baptized in that region. All of them had belonged to the United Brethren. But Wilfrid said, "Look, I need more help here. I wonder," he added longingly, "why the rest of the 12 do not come from America, because they didn't all come at once." Wilford Woodruff had arrived early, others came later. In fact, 3 days later, the second group of apostles arrived. Brigham Young was with them. Do I have an image of him? Yes, Brigham Young and Orson Pratt. And there is an actual rare color photograph of George A. Smith. That is from the film 6 Days in August. I happen to really like the actor who performed George A. Smith, portrayed him. Brigham Young was a carpenter, a joiner, and a glazier, again, of the working class. It could not have been more fitting, in a way, for what they were called to do. But he'd been a dedicated and committed Latter-day Saint missionary since 1832, and by now he was president of the Quorum. Heber C. Kimball was also with him, coming back. He knew his way around a bit. He was a blacksmith, a potter, a carpenter. He felt at ease when he visited the potteries. Orson Pratt, age 28, was probably the best educated of the apostles, certainly a brilliant individual. But he came with his brother Parley. And between them, they authored most of the tracts and pamphlets that were used by the missionaries. Parley was 32. He was a farmer, but he had been a preacher of the disciples of Christ. And then George A. Smith, who by now was a ripe old 22, the youngest of the group. He'd devoted much of his time in recent years to missionary work. Immediately, the Quorum held a meeting in Preston. There they ordained Willard Richards to be an apostle. That had been ordained back in the United States, but he'd stayed from that first mission through to this second mission, and they hadn't been able to do it. He was 36. He'd been doing missionary work during the intervening years. And this brought the number of apostles in England to 8. 3 others, Orson Hyde, John E. Page, and William B. Smith, did not fulfill a mission to England. And then there was 1 vacancy left in the Quorum at this time. Orson Hyde would eventually come through. John Page and William Smith never came on the mission to England, and they eventually fell away, which I think is significant. Willard Richards' first assignment was to go to Herefordshire. John Taylor was sent back to Liverpool, as I said. He spent his time there not only doing missionary work, but also helping to select hymns for the hymn book and reading proofs for the printing of the Book of Mormon. Brigham Young, as soon as he was able to get substantial loans from John Benbow and another faithful local member named Thomas Kington, he went to Manchester and rented a house as headquarters there. The church has long had a headquarters presence in Manchester and began working toward the publication of the Book of Mormon. Parley Pratt went directly to Manchester after he was done in Preston. He'd been appointed to edit something called the Millennial Star, and I think, well, no, we're still not there. So I'll go back, but we'll eventually have images of those things. And he remained there throughout the mission, except for a period in July through October when he went back to get his family, because he knew he was going to be staying there. He would stay for a year and a half after the rest of the 12 left. Now, Heber C. Kimball had a colorful way with words, and this is one of the things he said. He wrote to George A. Smith on the 12th of December that he was glad to learn of the prosperity of the work in that part of the land. You say the devil is mad. This makes me glad, and I shall not try to please him. Now, they did run into opposition. There's one story about Theodore Turley, who came with that second mission. Turley had been preaching quite a bit, came back, and Joseph Smith called him on a mission to England, and Joseph said, but you will spend some time looking through bars, basically, before you come back. And eventually he was thrown in prison. And they saw that as fulfillment of prophecy. But here's another thing. Well, no, Orson Hyde. I guess we just got to get him out of the way. I keep showing him. Orson Hyde did come through on a mission to England later on, but was only there briefly because he was continuing on to a mission to the Holy Land, as you know, to dedicate the Holy Land for the return of the Jews. Parley Pratt, I'm way behind here. Don't have them indicated on my notes. Didn't get that far to do that. I thought I could remember it, but I don't. There's Parley Pratt, a little older than he was when he was in England. Now, I wanted to talk about this house. Now, I am one of those weirdos in the church who would like to see the church buy this house. I'll tell you the story that happened there, and then you'll understand why it's so bizarre that I want that. It's probably never going to happen. The missionaries faced lots of tests of their faith. I mentioned imprisonment of Theodore Turley. I mentioned satanic attacks on the missionaries in one place. Here's the most famous one. On the 30th of July, that morning around daybreak, the missionaries had an encounter with satanic forces at their lodging in St. Wilfrid Street. And that's this place. It's still standing there. Isaac Russell awoke elders Kimball and Hyde, telling them that he was afflicted by evil spirits and asked them to pray for him to receive relief. Elder Kimball described what transpired during that blessing. While thus engaged, I was struck with great force by some invisible power and fell senseless on the floor as if I had been shot. And the first thing I recollected was that I was supported by brothers Hyde and Russell, who were beseeching a throne of grace on my behalf. They then laid me on the bed, but my agony was so great that I could not endure, and I was obliged to get out, and fell on my knees and began to pray. I then sat on the bed and could distinctly see the evil spirits who foamed and gnashed their teeth upon us. We gazed upon them for about an hour and a half, so this is not a momentary thing. And I shall never forget the horror and malignity, depicted on the countenances of these foul spirits. And any attempt to paint the scene which then presented itself, or portray the malice and enmity depicted in their countenances, it would be vain. I perspired exceedingly, and my clothes were as wet as if I had been taken out of the river. I felt exquisite pain, and was in the greatest distress for some time. Yet by it I learned the power of the adversary, his enmity against the servants of God, and got some understanding of the invisible world. Now, there are two of us that I know of that wish somebody would buy this building. It's kind of derelict. It was owned, at least at one point a few years ago when I was there, by a Muslim man who wanted to sell it. Apparently it has a reputation even among non-LDS in the area as the Devil House, probably because of this story. Elder Holland was once approached about the idea of buying it, and his comment was, "We don't typically buy places as monuments to Satan." So I don't think the official church is likely to do it anytime soon. But I just think it's an important place in church history, and it is a kind of monument to the supernatural, if you will, to the existence of another world. Not the good world here, but anyway. So anyway, what is the success what is the reason for the success of the missionaries? I think it's partly the idea of building Zion, building a society that would get them out of what they saw as the unjust class conflict there. And you can imagine what it was like before the free market brought prosperity to a lot of people. It really cemented the hold of the aristocracy and certain early capitalists who were not always as Christian as they might have been in their treatment of poorer people. You see that in the story of Scrooge, I suppose. This is Dickens going after people who made their money and did not share it. But one thing is, the success of the church there didn't lie with the Book of Mormon. We normally think of the Book of Mormon as key to conversion. But in 1840, the British had never seen one. Well, maybe a few had seen one, but not many. Most new converts didn't see it. They hadn't read it. Why? Because there were import duties on books, and it was terribly expensive. So one of the most important things that Brigham Young set about to do was to publish an edition of the Book of Mormon, which an English edition, which is very, very important, but only came out on the 21st of February, 1841. So relatively late when it was made available to the British saints. I mean, they just couldn't send copies from America. It was much too expensive. Saints there couldn't afford it. Many of them, as you've already heard, were out of work or living hand to mouth or almost starving. So 9 apostles served missions to Great Britain between 1839 and 1841. That is in the second mission. Brigham Young, Heber C. Kimball, Orson Hyde, Parley Pratt, Orson Pratt, John Taylor, Wilford Woodruff, George A. Smith, and Willard Richards. As I say, William Smith and Johnny Page were called to go to Britain, but they didn't go. Important things happened there. Willard Richards was already living in England and was ordained an apostle when the other members of the 12 arrived with the commission to do just that. Why is this so important? Well, it's important because it sets the foundation for the church in England, and I'll come back briefly to that again. It's also important in my mind because it welded the quorum together and made the quorum of the 12 what we know today as the Quorum of the 12. Remember that when they were first called, they were a traveling high council. They were a missionary council. They were intended to take the gospel to the world, but not to adjudicate affairs within the church. That was the responsibility of the high council. We now have lots of high councils, but in those days there was only one or maybe two, and they were of seemingly equal authority to the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. And so it's only after this mission to England, their return, that it changes. In October 1840, the prophet Joseph Smith called upon the 12 to come back. He says, having carried the testimony to that land, and numbers having received it, the leaven can now spread without your being obliged to stay. By the time they left, there were almost 6,000 saints in Britain. Another 800 had emigrated already. So we were already hearing British accents, William Clayton's among them, in Nauvoo. For the next 2 decades, missionary activity produced a steady flow of immigrants to America. Many people also fell away from the church, but its attraction was such that it continued to grow. The only thing that really slowed it down eventually was the public admission of the practice of plural marriage, which had a really negative impact on missionary numbers there. Brigham Young summarized the accomplishments of all of the apostles during their 1-year sojourn in the British Isles. We baptized between 7,000 and 8,000. Printed 5,000 books of Mormon, 3,000 hymn books, 2,500 volumes of the Millennial Star, and 50,000 tracts. Wilford Woodruff said it this way, truly the Lord hath blessed us in a manner not looked for. It hath truly been a miracle what God hath wrought by our hands in this land since we have been here, and I am astonished when I look at it. But the mission to England transformed the 12. It welded them together. It gave them leadership experience. They were the leaders of the church in the United Kingdom. They were too far away from Joseph Smith to be able to ask him for guidance on every little step they had to take. So when they decided to print the Book of Mormon, they decided. They oversaw the production of it. Brigham Young, not the most book-learned person in the universe, oversaw the printing of the Book of Mormon. They made all the decisions for leadership and organization and who the local leaders were that they should call. They had, in a way, already led the church, or a substantial portion of the church, by the time they came back and in 1844 were called upon to lead the whole church. So again, providential to my mind. And by that time, a lot of the people they would be leading were converts from England. When the time came to choose between Sidney Rigdon and the 12, the people in Nauvoo knew the 12. Sidney Rigdon had been kind of absent without leave for a long time. And for a little while, he'd actually been back in Pittsburgh. So there was not much of a decision for many of them. They already knew and trusted and loved the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, who had worked with them, lived with them, suffered with them in England. And so Joseph sees that and says it's time for the 12 to step up and take their proper role beside the first presidency. And so when Joseph Smith is unable to lead a meeting, he calls upon Brigham Young to lead it. It's clear to me that he saw the 12 now as his proper successors. I've heard people, I saw it just the other day online, where somebody said the 12 were never meant to be leaders of the church. Look at Section 102. Well, Section 102 was supplanted by what the prophet did in 1842 and onward in Nauvoo. He put the 12 clearly next to him, and that was the intention. And he gave them the keys, which nobody else had received, not Sidney Rigdon. The only other person who had them was Hiram Smith, but Hiram died with Joseph at Carthage jail. So there are other things that you begin to see. There's a really fine book. I'll show you a cover of it in a moment by Eugene England called Brother Brigham. And I really like the book. Uh, Eugene England wrote really well, and he loved Brigham Young. A lot of people see Eugene England as a very liberal thorn in the side of the church, which he kind of was. But as they used to say of Tommy Lasorda, if you cut him, he bled Dodger blue. If you cut Jane England, he bled Mormon. And he loved Brigham Young. And it turns out, I learned this only the other day from not Ron Rungbig, Ron Esplin, who said, yeah, Gene wrote that book on the basis of Leonard Arrington's notes and my notes on Brigham Young. So it carries some authority. But Gene noticed something, I think, as an English professor and stylist that was really interesting. He says, you read the letters of the Quorum of the Twelve in England, you begin to notice gradually they all start to refer to Brigham Young as the president. He's just the president. They don't have to refer to him as Brother Young. Before, he was just the oldest among them, and he'd recently been called to lead them. He becomes the president. I think that they recognize his leadership quality. So what did they do in England? It's pretty amazing what they accomplished there. Oh, there's the 1841 English edition of the Book of Mormon. Yeah, here are a couple of books that I like about Brigham Young. This section in Jane England's book about the mission to England is quite interesting to me. But what did they do here's another one. I surprised myself with my images. So Men with a Mission, The Quorum of the Twelve Apostles in the British Isles by James Allen, Ron Esplin, and David Whitaker. I think, the standard work on the subject. And a really wonderful painting on the cover of it, too, showing the immigrant ships in Liverpool. 6 days in August. Well, shoot. I had a baptismal scene. It didn't make it in, I guess. Let me see. Look ahead. Nope, it did not make it in. Gosh, I went to the trouble of finding it. Well, you don't want to look at this too long. But some of the story is covered in 6 days in August, so I'll give a commercial for the film if you haven't already seen it. We show a little bit of them in England. It was actually filmed not in England, I'm sorry to say, but we found a green and pleasant place that looked right. And show John Benbow and the Gadfield Elm Chapel and the arrival of the apostles in England and so on. Well, missionary activity began in England in 1837. The most historically significant boost to it came, though, in 1840, 1841, when the Quorum of the 12 Apostles was sent to take charge of the work there. By the time they left, they'd not only personally baptized hundreds of people, but authorized others to baptize hundreds more, thousands more. They established an effective missionary system that soon became the most productive in the church. They laid the foundation for the publication program of the church by producing the first European edition of the Book of Mormon, compiling and distributing a hymn book for the saints in England, publishing about 50 to 60,000 tracts and pamphlets, establishing the Latter-day Saints Millennial Star, which continued publication up well into my lifetime. I've forgotten when it was done away with, I think in 1970 maybe, or thereabouts, when all the publications were consolidated and the improvement era was abolished by the Ensign and so on and so forth. They organized a transatlantic migration program that would result within 50 years in the move to America of more than 88,000 European saints, including about 55,000 from Great Britain, which explains why sometimes the anti-Mormon agitators in the United States could, with some justice, point to the Latter-day Saints as being un-American. We literally were. Many of us were British. If you were walking on the streets in Salt Lake, you'd hear English accents. You'd see people from Denmark and Norway, most of whom came through Liverpool, because that was where the system was organized. And I meant to look up something else, but I didn't. There's a wonderful passage in Charles Dickens called The Uncommercial Traveler, one of his lesser-known works, in which he describes the Mormon emigration agent who's coordinating the immigration of Latter-day Saints, in his case from London, I think, not Liverpool. And he says, I went down to see the dregs of the earth. I went down to see these people and report on this bizarre phenomenon of all these crazy religious fanatics emigrating to the United States. But he said, what I saw was so well organized, so brilliantly done, and the people were of a different quality than I expected. He says they were, if you can say, the pick and flower of England. That's coming from Charles Dickens, a very acute observer. The Mormon immigration agent, I think, was almost certainly, by that point, George Q. Cannon, who'd been born on the Isle of Man and then converted in Liverpool and then had gone to the United States. Eventually became the pivotal figure in the establishment of the church in Hawaii, and then came back to England as the immigration agent, the European mission president, and so on and so forth. A really important guy who, by the way, was a descendant of Manx ship captains, ended up going to Hawaii and Europe and back and forth and back and forth, and could not look at the ocean without becoming violently ill. Somehow he didn't pick up the genetic inheritance from his sea captain ancestors, but one of the pivotal figures in the 19th century and very early 20th century church. So Orson Hyde then went on after they left. He went on to the Holy Land, and they came back to a new role. They were shocked. Brigham Young was actually shocked and a little disappointed when he was told not to travel anymore, because he expected to go out on further missions, and he was commanded to stay home and look after his affairs there. And it turns out that was basically Brigham's call for the rest of his life. He stayed near church headquarters because he was the leader of the church, or soon to be, and was sending other people out. So he was disappointed, but he did what he was told. Now, what have we inherited from the British mission? My word, so much. So I've already mentioned that many of our ancestors come from England, and I'm hoping that some of you will have looked up where you're from so that we can say something about it, share stories on the trip. I've had that happen before, and it's always been fun. The Tabernacle Choir itself is basically the legacy of Welsh converts to the church. And then think of the leaders that we've gotten. I don't include a picture here of George Q. Cannon. I should have. Certainly very important. But think of people like James E. Talmage, B.H. Roberts, Patrick Kiran, currently of the Quorum of the 12, not a descendant of those early converts, but still a legacy of the founding of the church in England. And then I wanted to say something briefly about Charles A. Callis, who is there, the third from the left. He's not very well known today. He was a member of the Quorum of the 12, died in 1947. But there's a wonderful story that's told about him. Some of you may have heard it. It's told in various forms. The form I've heard it in is that there's an elderly man they put on a ceremony to celebrate his life and his contributions and his achievements, his leadership in the church, and so on. And then he responds and he says, "Well, thank you. This is very generous of you. You haven't said much about my mission, and that's fine, because my mission was something of a failure. I really baptized only one barefoot little Irish boy, and it was in London. He was from Ireland, but living in London at the time. And he said, so I really can't claim any success. And there was a man who'd come in. This kind of gets me when I tell the story. There's a man who'd come in the back, sat down very quietly, and then stood up and said, I was that barefoot Irish boy. And it was Elder Callis of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. And I would think that, if your mission netted a member of the Quorum of the 12, future member of the Quorum of the 12, you could count that as something of a success. You done all right. So the legacy of the British mission to me is incomparably rich, not only for leadership of the church, for the equipping of the Quorum of the 12 to lead the church when the time came, the training of the apostles to do all that they needed to do in taking over from Joseph Smith. They'd already led the church, in effect, when Joseph was unavailable. Now, when he was truly unavailable, they knew how to do it. And then the legacy, the harvest of converts that we've received from those early days, unbelievable, and the impact that it's had on our writing, our music, everything about church culture, if you will. I think just tremendous. Cannot be overstated how important this is. And we'll have the chance to go see many of the important areas where these events happened, and some of them are, to me, still profoundly moving. So I look forward to joining you there, and thank you very much for putting up with me. And sorry about the chaotic disorganization of this, but we got through it. At least I did. I don't know if anyone's still out there. So thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Bruce, have you been kind of looking through the chat and come up with questions?
No,
Anyone have any questions?
nothing has been posted to chat, so.
Okay.
I don't blame them.
But
No,
but actually,
it was,
you've had a good turnout, Dan. A
Oh,
uh-huh,
good.
fair number
yeah,
of people here watching it, even if you can't see it. So
yeah. And it was fabulous. It was a wonderful introduction to these incredible saints. I'm going to spend a little time on the tour too, talking about the women
Yeah.
that sent their husbands off on missions and the women that immigrated from the UK, and the devotion of these individuals and their
Yes.
dedication to the Savior Jesus Christ. It really pales, speaking from personal experience here, it pales in comparison to anything that's been asked of me, and their willingness to give and to do is just, one of the things that has empowered my testimony of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And it's also given me a perspective of how little is required of me and how much I've been given. And certainly part of that is because of the great legacy and the example of these early saints.
Yeah, we are so comfortable compared to what they went through, and just the crossing of the Atlantic. I mean,
Oh,
if you go into the Maritime Museum there in Liverpool and you get a chance to look in at the little steerage compartment where people would stay, the ones that weren't well off, it's
mhm,
unbelievable.
mhm,
And they would stay for weeks out on the ocean. Uh,
mhm.
and then you arrive in the New World, and then you've got to cross the continent.
Uh-huh.
And
Yeah, yeah.
so it really it's amazing to me, and I think these stories must not be forgotten.
No, no, they can't be. And it really will give people a whole different context, you know, when we think that we are put upon
Yeah,
sometimes by the demands that, come with being a member of the church,
yeah.
when really it's just unbelievable again.
People have asked me sometimes, do you ever have moments when your testimony is weak? Well, the weakest for me often have come when I've been in a leadership position and the alarm has gone off at 6 a.m. and I have to get up for a leadership meeting. And I think at that point, I wish the church weren't true. I don't want it to be true. I just want to go back to sleep. And I think, compare that to what they had to go through. Pretty pathetic.
Yeah, yeah. Even the 12. I mean, quite a number of them going over. They just were a horrible seasickness the entire voyage.
Yeah, yeah.
We get
Brigham
on a
Young was in
plane.
terrible shape.
Yeah, we get on a plane and we're squished into a little seat, but
Yeah,
we're there in, now 10 and a half hours from Salt Lake or wherever you're going from.
yeah,
And, you can survive that terrible meal on the plane,
yeah. I
particularly in
flew
comparison.
once. I flew once from I think it was St. Louis to Salt Lake, and I got a middle seat, which made me really, really mad. And then all they had was pretzels, and I get tired of pretzels, and I'm sitting there feeling sorry for myself. This is going to be how many hours? And then I almost heard a voice. This is almost exactly the route of the handcart pioneers. You loser. Just
Hmm,
they would
hmm,
not be impressed to hear you whine.
hmm. Well, and you know
So
what you've been mentioning too, it's a really good context too to understand the Martin and Willie handcart companies, and then what was the wagon company that came along too. So many of those were saints and converts from England,
yeah,
and we think of them as these hardy individuals, but they had absolutely no experience as pioneers crossing the plains.
right, right.
And so this took an enormous amount of sacrifice and dedication on their part. And then I have to think too that they come from this lush, landscape and these,
Yeah,
like, bucolic, villages and stuff. Although a lot of them are coming out of working class, big industrial cities. But nevertheless, those when they hit Salt Lake, and honestly, Salt Lake, we forget that it's a semi-arid climate.
yeah,
I mean, if it wasn't for Brigham Young irrigating, and what they see is basically a desert,
yeah,
and that had to stun them too.
yeah. This is the promised land.
Hmm.
This is it.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh, and then congratulations. Now you're called to go on down to St. George.
Yeah, or to the Iron Mission, or to any of those. Yes. Uh-huh. So yeah. So, anyways, we will learn more, and there is nothing quite like being there. I
Yeah,
always tell people, if you have a chance to go to church history sites, grab that opportunity, because
right.
it totally change. You can read about it all you want, but to be immersed,
Yeah,
and we hope that that's the kind of experience that everyone on this tour will have with all
yeah,
the things that we're going to see and do, and to understand the world that these saints came from.
right.
So
Yep,
yeah.
yep. I hope
Are
it'll
there
make a
any
difference.
questions, Bruce? Have you got anything?
nope.
Okay. All right. I think we will probably end on that note, thank you so much, Dan. Wonderful introduction to these individuals. I recommend all of those books. Everyone that you know what, the other one I really like is Richard L. Evans. It's a little older, it's dated, but his book is just, it's touching in its own right too.
Right, it is. Yeah.
So anyways, so thank you very much, and we will see you next week, and looking forward to our trip.
Thank you.
Thank you.